Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, can we arrest climate change with wind scrubbers that filter out CO2 and an orbiting 600,000 square mile space mirror to deflect sunlight? Or is this all just smoke and mirrors? We asked the Climate Institute's chief scientist, Mike McCracken. What's left of the Statue of Liberty credo? We ask Ralston Deffenbaugh of the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. It's the not too distant future in Washington, D.C. There's a state of emergency. A young mother tries to carve out a life amidst bombings, shootings, natural disasters, and civil war. Far-fetched? Susan Shreve is here to talk about her 12th novel. Also poetry by Sami Miranda, Adriane Harjo, and Brandon Johnson. And the one-man blues band, Curtis Blues, on the Coffee House.
Welcome to 21st Century Life at the Coffee House. When it comes to global warming, our fragile, life-giving climate continues to fall apart much faster than we human beings seem capable of responding to. The Greenland ice sheet is in rapid meltdown, with potentially 23 feet of sea level rise crashing into coastal Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. True, as George Bush does nothing in Washington, many states like Maryland have passed laws phasing in clean electricity and green buildings. But many scientists doubt we have enough time to build the political will needed to take the really big and necessary steps to break the fossil fuel habit and prevent climate catastrophe. So, increasingly, there's talk among scientists of quote-unquote geo-engineering, meaning organized human efforts to artificially cool the atmosphere through technological gadgets and chemicals. Ideas range from giant orbiting space mirrors that deflect sunlight away from the Earth to floating cloud factories in our oceans, generating the white puffs needed to block incoming rays. Is this just science fiction fantasy, or does geoengineering offer real hope? Here to discuss this is distinguished climate expert Michael McCracken, chief scientist at the Climate Institute here in Washington, D.C. Dr. McCracken, welcome back to the Coffee House.
Thank you, Mike.
Well, let's just, for a moment, tell us in a little more detail, what is geoengineering? It sounds sort of benign, but this is a pretty awesome concept, isn't it?
Well, it is. Our human activities are changing the climate, and the question is, can one come up with something that will try and counter that influence rather than having to basically give up using coal, oil, and natural gas over the next 50 to 100 years.
Now, you've said that we human beings have been inadvertently warming the planet as an unintended consequence of our use of oil, coal, and natural gas for many years now. So why not advertently try to cool the planet? Because, frankly, it doesn't look like we're making enough progress getting off the fuels that cause global warming.
Well, first we have to figure out how large a task it is, and it's really a huge task. We've been burning fossil fuels for 150 years, and we're burning more and more people want to use them. So we're changing the planet in a dramatic way, and if you're going to try and counter that, you would have to do something really dramatic, and that's hard to do.
Well, you're certainly one of the world's most respected climate scientists, certainly here in the United States. You've worked in the U.S. Government Office of Global Change, and you're outspoken on this issue. Is this inevitable? I mean, it seems sort of unbelievable that we human beings could give up, throw up our hands and say, well, we can't seem to stop changing the climate, so let's aggressively and on our own do something about it. Is this inevitable that we're going to use gadgets and science to try to artificially cool the planet?
Well, I hope the answer is no. I hope governments and everybody will change their mind and will change our energy system. But in the event that one really does get Greenland melting rapidly, and you would cause over centuries 20 or so feet of sea level rise, that would inundate a tremendous amount of land. So you might want to have an insurance policy sort of sitting back there, and possibly, to see if it would work, to try and do something. But the problem with all these geoengineering schemes is it doesn't solve all of the problems. It just solves maybe a few if it works at all.
Well, let's talk about some of those schemes. Give us some ideas of what's being discussed. And, well, first of all, how seriously is this being discussed? Because it seems like the idea of geoengineering went from the wilderness, the fringe sort of realm of scientific discussion to more prominent mainstream discussions. How seriously is this being discussed, and by who?
Well, it's been discussed for actually quite some time. The National Academy had a major section on it in a report in 1991 or 92 that went over the proposals and tried to evaluate them, and actually suggested that the one that would be most cost effective is basically creating a human volcano, launching sulfur dioxide up into the stratosphere and creating the haze, creating a haze that reflects away some of the solar radiation. But that's a tremendously difficult task. I mean, you have to put millions of tons of sulfur dioxide up into the stratosphere every year.
Now, we know that Mount Pinatubo in the early 1990s did, in fact, cool the planet by, I think, a degree, half a degree Celsius.
A degree, yeah.
Right. And so we saw this cooling. It lasted for about 2 years, and then we returned to the warming path. So we're talking about creating like a permanent human volcano where we would put this same sulfur dioxide that comes from volcanoes into the atmosphere in perpetuity, or at least until we could get off fossil fuels.
Well, no, it's actually more in perpetuity because the CO2 lasts a long time in the atmosphere. Unlike other pollutants which come out, well, ozone comes out in days, or sulfur dioxide, sulfates come out in the lower atmosphere in a few days in acid rain. The CO2 we put in the atmosphere, well, at least half of it remains basically a couple of hundred years, and some of it remains much, much longer. And so its influence, warming influence, will continue for many centuries. And so you would have to counter it for that long a time. So this is basically an obligation you're putting on many future generations to try and do this. So it's a huge step if you start to take that.
So let's say human beings say, well, we've got to generate our own global air conditioning system, and we're the managers, we're going to do it. How, for example, with sulfur dioxide, how do we get the sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to bring this cooling effect? How does it get delivered?
Well, what the National Academy figured out, I mean, you could fly airplanes, you could do a whole bunch of other things, but the National Academy's estimate of the least expensive way was to put large artillery pieces on tropical islands and fire 1,000-pound shells up into the stratosphere sort of continuously to try and get it up there. So it's technically sort of doable, but it would have a lot of important consequences. It would turn the sky more whitish. It would make it much less practical to use direct solar energy, the direct beam of the sun, to generate energy. For example, reflecting it off mirrors to create thermal electric power plants. It greatly diminishes the potential for that, has the potential to destroy ozone in the polar regions. So there are a number of environmental problems with doing that. You'd have pretty sunrises and sunsets, but you have a lot of basic environmental problems.
You're talking about giant artillery cannons shooting canisters of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere in perpetuity to keep the planet artificially
well, let me tell you the other approaches.
Isn't this madness?
Let me tell you the other approaches that the National Academy sort of summarized. One was, well, if you can put mirrors into orbit around the Earth, you would reflect solar radiation. So how many mirrors would you need to put up this century? Well, they postulated 50,000 mirrors. Well, 50,000 mirrors, maybe I could do that if I could keep them up there. But each one has to be about 6 miles by 6 miles in size. It would flicker across the sun. I mean,
50,000 mirrors, each one is 6 by 6.
Each about 6 by 6 miles, okay. All right, so you say, well, is there anything else? I mean, can I put the other proposal for a satellite kind of system is to put one between the sun and the Earth, 1,000,000 miles toward the sun, where the gravitational pull between the sun and the Earth is about the same, so it sort of hovers there. But this one has to be of order 1,000 miles in diameter. So how would you get something like that there? Well, one proposal is you'd build a manufacturing plant on the moon. Well, that means you have to get to the moon before you can start to do it.
We would rather do all of this than switch to hybrid cars?
That's right. And that's what looking at geoengineering does. Now, there's other proposals about just shooting lots and lots, sort of 1,000,000 mirrors, small mirrors up there or something like that, instead of trying to create one big one. But this is a huge task.
But there's also the idea, maybe more benign, of of increasing the albedo, the reflectivity of the surface of the Earth, for example, by floating giant white plastic islands in the oceans that would reflect more sunlight?
Well, but you'd have to have sort of a styrofoam island the size of a continent floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I mean, the other approach that's proposed is to try and make the clouds brighter, and you would basically go and try and spray salt water into the air, and that does make the clouds brighter. Of course, you have to pay for the energy to run the boat, and that might be with carbon dioxide or something. But you might do that in special areas, for example, over coral reefs that are particularly vulnerable, and you want to keep the water from getting too hot there, maybe over the Great Barrier Reef or something. You might think about it. Doing it for the whole Earth is a tremendous task.
Well, let me ask you, you're a close observer of both the rapidity of climate change, excuse me, as we're seeing it on Earth now. It's certainly accelerating. There are a lot of people who are concerned. And you're a close observer of the political side. I mean, we just don't seem to be making as much progress on getting off of fossil fuels as we are in observing and measuring the climate change. Is this inevitable? Do you see some version of geoengineering coming into play as an emergency backup as we get off fossil fuels? Is this going to happen in your view in some fashion?
Well, I mean, there are sort of small measures being taken, trying to insulate glaciers and do other things, make cities more white to try and cool cities off. But doing it on a planetary basis would be a tremendous effort and a tremendous commitment, and it wouldn't solve the really key problem that exists, which is this rising CO2 concentration alone is going to dramatically affect marine life in the ocean, because you need a relatively low CO2 concentration for the organisms that make shells to be able to do that. So you start damaging that.
So we're acidifying the oceans through our use of fossil fuels apart from global warming.
Yeah, just apart from the warming itself. So we've got some tremendous problems. I mean, the scientific view, when it gets away from speaking in detail about papers, is basically saying we're sort of past the situation of headed toward dangerous climate change, which is something that there's protocols about. We're sort of on the question, can we avoid catastrophic change? Can we avoid really starting that melting of Greenland that causes sea level to rise dramatically? And that happened 120,000 years ago when it was sort of hot because of variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun. Sea level was maybe 3 to 5 meters, so 10 to 15 feet above where it is now. So it can happen.
And it can happen quickly. And it seems to me that what you're saying, I know that there are a lot of things that we can do to reduce the greenhouse gases. We can switch to clean energy. We can switch to hybrid cars. And some of that's being done. California, of course, just passed the Schwarzenegger plan calling for dramatic reductions in greenhouse gases. But increasingly, it seems like geoengineering might be part of the mix of responses to global warming. And it's certainly something you hear more talk about.
Well, we really need to look and understand it. People are going to constantly ask the question, well, isn't there something you can do that would make things better?
Do we have time to avoid it? Do you think we have time to avoid it?
To avoid warming or to avoid
geoengineering?
I sure
solving
hope
this
so.
problem without geoengineering.
I sure hope we can find some ways to do that, but it's going to be very, very difficult.
Well, a big thanks to Dr. Michael McCracken of the Climate Institute for discussing this concept of climate engineering by human beings in the face of rapid global warming. Personally, I do believe that some form of geoengineering may be inevitable as we simultaneously get off fossil fuels as fast as we can. I'm Mike Tidwell, and this has been 21st Century Life.
The only thing I see is dark and lithe as seaweed underwater, walking toward a mailbox. And in that moment, when vehicles, music, and minds slow to the pace of a snail crawling, growing grass, my car becomes a sepulcher. She is young, cool, smiling, it appears, for no reason except that it is morning and she has mail. I want to believe that if I get out, dance between bumpers and brake lights, ignore horns and comatose commuters, allow myself to worship on hands and knees at the altar of black skin flowing across her swaying frame, an uncut blade in a field of violets, this saint for wayward eyes would bless this god-awful traffic, would resurrect this dead morning into something forever worth seeing every day. Once before I believed this, sidled across a dance floor, captured a bored woman's eyes, laced my fingers with hers, and never stopped dancing. But some might think my passion has no payoff, might think the only thing I gain from craving this girl is a dull swelling, heaving breath, an unquenched thirst on an ocean of buoyed vixens. But in this same moment, everything tells me, move ahead, straight, smooth as Miles doing his thing on my radio, because my adoration is requited by memory of something I already have, needn't long for again. Now the tedium of the commute is gone. The familiar is disguised as something new, this central theme. A young woman's skin glistening in my side view mirror, shrinking like a spaceman's view of the phantasmic moon as he comes down to earth. A quintet's music resounds in my head, tells me that if I stay in my capsule, I'll be fine. Reminds me that if I wasn't married, was 20 years younger, I'd be dumber than a rack of basketballs. Again. So drive on, re-enter, leave that girl alone to break the heart of a kid her age before he grows to be me.
Welcome to the Willing Spirit at the Coffee House. The neighborhood where I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, underwent a dramatic change around the time that I began junior high school in 1979. My school, which had formerly consisted of Caucasians and African Americans, suddenly became about a third Southeast Asian, mostly refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Many of these families were sponsored by local Lutheran churches that worked to smooth their transition by helping with housing, jobs, and schools, and other basic necessities of life. Many of these churches were connected to LIRS, the Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services, which is now one of the largest agencies in the country working to resettle and to advocate for displaced people. Now, since 9/11, our country has been taking a hard look at its policies towards immigrants and refugees. A number of people, including legislators, would like to make it significantly harder to come into the United States as an immigrant or as a refugee. Where do American congregations fit into this conversation today? My guest is Ralston Deffenbaugh, who has led LIRS for the past 15 years. He's a legal expert and an advocate, a friend to refugees, and a person of faith. Welcome to the Coffee House and to the Willing Spirit.
Thanks very much.
Can you say a little bit, first off, about how your work has changed since September 11th, 2001?
Well, we've seen tremendous changes, in part because of the increased fear in our country. And of course, a lot of that fear is understandable after the horrible attacks of 9/11. But ironically, part of what we've seen has been in the attempt of the United States to try to protect itself from the bad guys. We've ended up closing the door to many victims of persecution themselves. We've seen in the 5 years since 9/11 that refugee admissions to the United States have been cut in half from where they were before. And we've also seen for immigrants much more fear, much more reluctance to extend that hand of welcome to the newcomer.
Now, your agency works with both immigrants and with refugees. Can you say a little bit about the difference, what those two categories actually are?
Sure.
And especially, we talk a lot about illegal immigrants. Are some of those people actually refugees, or are those categories distinct at this point?
Well, if you think of sort of a pie or something, there's the broader group would be immigrants, and then within this category of immigrants, you have documented or undocumented immigrants, legal or illegal. And then also within that category of immigrants, you have refugees. Refugees are people who have had to flee their country and are unwilling or unable to return because of a well-founded fear of persecution. Immigrants, more broadly, are people who have left their country and find themselves in a new place. In terms of the debate that we're having now in the country, normally we think of immigrants or migrants as people who are coming for work or for family reasons, and refugees those who are coming to seek freedom. But among those refugees who are coming, we have some that our country invites into the country for official refugee resettlement, but we have others who make their own way to the United States and then lay claim for political asylum once they've come here. And that latter group, the asylum seekers, have also been hit hard post 9/11. Many more of them are now being detained in immigration detention facilities while their immigration claims are being adjudicated. So we have this irony that this nation, which lifts up liberty and tries to be a beacon to the oppressed, is actually locking up people who come here seeking freedom.
And so, in other words, some portion of the group of people who we would describe as illegal immigrants are actually refugees or asylum seekers in this country?
Yes, when a portion of those who enter the country without documents, a portion of them are coming here to seek freedom.
And can you say a word then about the role that American congregations have played in hosting and supporting, refugees mostly, right, who come into the United States?
Sure. Well, there's, of course, a very, very strong biblical and theological basis for this work. If we open our Bibles, we see in the Old Testament the story of a refugee people. If we open the New Testament, we see the story of a refugee family, the Holy Family, who had to flee to Egypt. And ever since then, in many of the Christian traditions, we have great leaders and others who have had to flee or who have migrated from one place to another. And many of our churches also have strong immigrant roots. In my tradition, the Lutheran tradition, many of us still trace back the grandfathers and grandmothers, or sometimes even the people themselves, like the people who populated your neighborhood in St. Paul, who have come themselves as migrants to this country. We also have in our theological understanding a tremendous story of Matthew 25, where Jesus says that the nations will be judged. How? Did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? Did you visit the prisoners? Did you welcome the stranger? And so as congregations get involved with refugees and with migrants, they're really just carrying out that call of our Lord to extend a hand of help, a hand of welcome to the stranger.
And is it mostly refugees, people who have applied for status as a refugee and then come to the United States, that congregations interact with?
Well, certainly in a formal way. And for example, in our work, we're one of 9 agencies that have contracts with the U.S. Department of State to actually receive and place refugees who are invited into the United States. And we in turn try to work as much as we can through local congregations to help extend that hand of welcome and to befriend the newcomers. But that doesn't limit the way that congregations can be involved. And so many congregations, of course, as our neighborhoods are changing, as our communities are changing, are extending that hand of welcome to all the newcomers, not just those who are admitted as refugees.
Have you seen the congregations that you work with that go through this process, formally become supporters or sponsors of a refugee family? Have you seen their attitudes towards refugee policy or immigration issues in general change as a result of their relationships with?
Oh, very, very much so. And there's nothing like that human contact, that face-to-face engagement, that befriendment that takes place to help expand one's ideas about people and about the world. I have a friend who used to direct our refugee programs in Iowa, and he used to say that every refugee resettled in Iowa is a lever of support for 100 refugees elsewhere in the world. Just as people get to know others.
Do you see, do congregations or the people involved sometimes then make the bridge to become advocates in a sort of in a policy setting?
Very, very much so. Very much so. And we see in our work that the voice of the people in the churches is tremendously effective in Washington.
Well, say a little bit about that, because this has been a year of just incredible, a lot of debate about immigration issues in this country.
Right.
and not a lot of action now at the end of the year, but still a lot of things sort of hanging. Say a word about what's happened this year and how congregations have interacted.
Sure. Well, first, of course, our immigration system is broken now in the country, and everyone from right to left across the spectrum agrees that the system needs to be fixed. The disagreement is, how does it need to be fixed? And we had, just before Christmas in 2005, the House of Representatives passed an enforcement-only bill that would have criminalized all the undocumented in the United States, defined them as felons, and would have also created a new crime for those of us in the churches who are providing assistance for those. And that got our attention, and I actually had to consult with my board chair about whether I would go to jail, to keep carrying out the work that we do on behalf of the church with migrants. And I'm particularly grateful for Cardinal Mahoney from Los Angeles, who in his Ash Wednesday sermon said that if that bill were to become law, that he would instruct his priests to violate it. Okay. And a lot of righteous Christians and other people of faith around the country rose up and said, well, we don't think this is right, and we're going to continue welcoming the stranger and serving our neighbor in need and so forth. And that gave a lot of energy, I think, to many of those, particularly in the Hispanic community, who came out on the streets and protested. The Senate passed a bill in May, which was much more comprehensive in nature and has significant flaws in my view, but would go much better toward trying to fix the system in a just way. And now, ironically, after the elections, we have a situation where President Bush, who wants comprehensive immigration reform, may have a better chance of getting that adopted with a Democratic Congress than he had with the Republican Congress before.
So what do you see coming up in 2007?
Well, I think there's a decent chance that the Congress might pass comprehensive immigration reform. And as we look to what we hope will pass, we hope that there will be a bill that will allow families to be united, that will allow willing workers and willing employers to find each other in an honest way that provides for human rights and workers' rights. Mm-hmm. And we hope that it will also provide a channel for those who are fleeing persecution to find freedom in our country.
Mm-hmm. And if somebody out there would like to become more involved with this issue, or like their congregation to become more connected to that.
Sure. We'd invite them to visit our website at lirs.org. And there are a number of ideas for congregational involvement, as well as prayer network and other biblical and theological resources available.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us your analysis about this incredibly complicated and confusing part of our country's future and conversation.
I've heard it said that heat leaves the body through the head, hands, and feet. But I have witnessed and I know what happens when Texas heat has nowhere to go. It finds its way back in through the space between your fingernails and fingers, your ear canals, the open hole of a mouth. It pulls a man down and brings his sons to his chest, wraps them in each other. It stretches the legs of a woman so her bare feet hang limp from the back of a tractor trailer. It rides out on them, leaving the desert silence in a truck stop on a Texas highway.
It's not pretty, Maria. Looking in the mirror, seeing everyone, everything that you said you would refuse to become, what you despise. It's an unbroken cycle, a chalk circle, a chalk outline. It's grit gnashed between your nearly perfect teeth, behind your blue-tinged lips, under broken nails, on flailing fists. It's not pretty, Maria. Forget the past, forgive it last. Forget the past, forgive it last. Forget the past, forgive it last. Sweat it out from the marrow of your bones. Let it soak into your hair. Pluck it out from the roots. Wipe your body down. Then wait for the pain to evaporate. Drag it along the well-worn carpet of the musty halls, to the stairs, to the basement, to the famished incinerator. and let it burn, baby, burn. Ashes to ashes, gather all those memories of pain. Dust to dust, sweep up all those curses of hate. Carry them out fractured to the sea, scatter the pixelated chaos to the winds. Forgive the past, forget it last. Forgive the past, forget it last. Forgive the past, forget it last. No, it's not pretty, Maria.
Welcome to Writer's Block at the Coffee House. Big city life has always included a certain degree of danger. We all know that. But imagine this picture of Washington, D.C., a city in a perpetual state of emergency, where random explosions and shootings are rampant, a city full of bomb threats, natural disasters, and killings, a city in the midst of civil war. This is the Washington, D.C. described by Susan Richards Shreve in her new novel, A Student of Living Things. It is a disturbing picture of a city in the not-too-distant future and of a young woman in the midst of the chaos trying to make sense of it for herself and her child. Susan Richards Shreve is a novelist and an essayist. Her books include 12 novels and 26 books for children, as well as 5 anthologies. She is a professor at George Mason University. Welcome back to the Coffee House.
It's wonderful to be here,
So nice
Lisa.
to have you again.
Thank you.
Start this off for us. Set the scene of this young woman.
The book begins, and the young woman is actually at the Eastern Market, and she has gone to the Eastern Market to shop for her groceries for a lunch that she's giving for her family who have never been to her apartment. The scene is that the National Guard has been called into Washington. There's a sense of terrific unrest, of real danger. We are not exactly sure what's going on, but there have been a number of small terrorist explosion activities. People have been killed. It's random. It is a sense of what might happen in the future. And it was my intent to have a kind of chilling beginning to this story. Her brother has been killed. This lunch is for his birthday. He was killed a few months before, assassinated on the steps of George Washington University Library.
And he's a law student who also writes op-ed pieces. And
he's an outspoken law student who has written a lot of op-ed pieces about any kind of injustice that he finds, particularly that perpetuated by the government.
And so there's some implication that his death may be tied in with his outspoken ideas about.
Exactly.
And it's his sister who is the center of this book, Claire
She's
Frame.
the voice. She tells the story. It is, in fact, and she's a young, innocent, adoring sister who was with her brother when he was assassinated. They were on their way home, and they were on the top step of the George Washington University Law Library when he was shot.
And you wanted to explore the notion of fear with this book, yes?
I did. We all had the experience of the sniper.
Yes.
And I think it was more the effect of that experience in a funny kind of way than 9/11, which felt, for all its awfulness, it was less close than that sense of something circling your life that may at any moment have you in mind as its target. And it was that kind of fear which I think terrorism also creates that I was interested in exploring. And it's in the city that is described in my book, really the death of this young man incites riot. People become, there's something about this particular killing that sets off little brush fires all over the city.
And also, before he dies, the night before, the flag, the Justice Department flag is, could you?
That's right. The Justice Department, they get up the next morning and someone has put the Justice Department flag on their house, and it's ominous.
Very much so.
And that particular day, he has an op-ed piece that takes on what might seem like the Patriot Act. He's doing some exploration in the kinds of things that the government has been doing under an act called the Freedom Act in the book, which allows them freedom to go in and check out people's houses, people's lives.
And his sister Claire is also a student at George Washington University.
Yes.
She's a biologist.
She's a biologist. She's an evolutionary biologist, just beginning graduate school. The book is called A Student of Living Things, and the title came to me before Claire came to me.
But you also talk about the living things in terms of, she has a lot of dead things. In her.
Yes, I had this student of living things, and in fact, in a kind of inadvertent way, her parents are very permissive in terms of allowing their children to explore and do whatever it is that catches their attention. And they've allowed Claire to fill her room with dead things. So she has kind of a natural history museum of dead animals and plants and a few living things, snakes, rats.
And once her brother is dead, she gets rid of
them.
The dead things.
The dead things.
And her life is changed dramatically after this death. She's hit on a personal level, even as all this external stuff is going on in this city. Would you talk about that?
Yes, her life, this is an odd family. It's I think, like all of our families are odd. Right. There's an aunt living there with her son who also is damaged, and there's a failed concert pianist uncle, and the father who's a doctor who's building an airplane restoring a World War II fighter plane in the backyard. And Claire has lived quite an innocent life, very protected by a very overprotective mother and this big family, and a big brother, who's kind of a dreamy big brother. He does all of these quite daring things and puts himself at risk, and has in her eyes a quality of the hero, and she feels very safe, and suddenly something happens to her. She's actually kind of annoyingly innocent. And so suddenly something happens that is beyond her imagination.
And then she's approached by someone who claims he's the brother's friend, Victor Duarte.
The first day she goes back to school after her brother's death, he's in the library. And he's kind of a seductive man, and he says that he knew her brother and persuades her that in fact he did. And then he says he knows who her brother's killer might be. And in a sense, his giving her an opportunity to be a part of some kind of perhaps finding who the killer is helps to bring her out of this terrible grief, which has made her practically catatonic.
And he gives her a reason to live, really.
A reason to live, and a mission
to avenge her brother's death.
Avenge his death.
But along the way, she falls in love, and not necessarily with we're not sure who. Would you talk a little bit about that too?
Well, she's very attracted to Victor Duarte. She actually asks him. He wants her to help lure this man.
The killer.
The man who he assumes is the killer, so that he can meet him. And this is left rather vague. And she is capable of dealing with a lot of vagueness, who she eventually has a relationship with by music, is this man who she is luring to Victor Duarte. She invents a new name. She calls herself Sophia Lupe. She writes to him, and she writes a very sweet kind of charmingly, innocently seductive letter to him, and he responds to her. She tells him he's a musician because she knows he's a musician, and he responds to her in music, in notes, in songs.
It's so interesting to me because of the whole notion of tragedy and danger, violence, political upheaval, and then the notion of healing and music.
I was thinking that the idea sort of delighted me to be able to have this correspondence in music. And at first, she's really trying to dupe him. Eventually, she gets very caught up in the music and has her uncle, the failed concert pianist who's delighted to do it, has him write the music back. So she is gradually healed by the music and by the letters.
Yes, it's a very nice device you have in the sense of you've got the actual music.
I have the actual
in the
music,
text.
the notes, and they're pretty.
Yes, yes. So if you can read music, you can pick up some of the melody, which is quite lovely.
Well, I understand. My husband's nephew wrote the music, who is a composer, and I understand that it suits the story. I have not played it, and I haven't heard it played.
And in the couple of minutes we have left, do you see this happening in Washington, just apart from your novel?
I really wanted to create a scene that could happen, a situation that seemed possible. I feel that fear has a capacity to unleash all kinds of things in people, and this is really a moment of chaos in which you bring in the National Guard in order to stop the chaos, but there's nothing you can do about the fear.
Right.
And so I did believe that. I believed it, and in a sense I believe it still. I think that violence is a part of our lives, but never more so than after we were threatened after 9/11.
Yes, and there's still very much of that.
Tremendous
anxiety.
distrust, suspicion of other people, suspicion of the other.
And the whole notion of not knowing what will happen next, what we can expect. It's a whole new
world.
Yeah, it's a whole
We
new...
had a great sense of the illusion of safety.
Right. It's a brand new landscape. So, and the Student of Living Things is about living finally in the end.
It's about living. It's about how do you live in such a time as this, because you certainly don't want to give in to it.
Absolutely.
And how do you survive such an event?
Exactly. Well, you do a beautiful job of painting this picture that is riveting and familiar to us in a funny kind of way, even as it's not quite what we're living with today. It is something possible.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Susan, for coming back with us on the Coffee House and for this prescient, thought-provoking novel. Again, the book is A Student of Living Things. I'm Lisa Page, and this has been Writer's Block.
Shoes and oh Lord, I must have had those old walking toes. That girl, she breaks in on a dollar man anywhere she goes. She got an Elgin movement from her head down to her toes. That girl, she breaks in on a dollar man anywhere she goes. Woke up this morning, feeling around for my shoes. Oh Lord, I must have heard those old walking blues. When I woke up this morning, man, I was feeling around for my shoes. Lord, I must have heard those walking blues. Yeah.
It's the great Robert Johnson.
Welcome, Curtis. Someday people will be sitting around saying, "Yeah, there's that old Curtis blues tune." That's amazing stuff.
Yeah,
That's
these
really
guys
good.
invented modern music, you know, and the Chicago bands took over with electric band music, but the originators of the style was all back in the 20s and 30s in Mississippi.
Yeah. Here on the Coffee House, which I want to slip in the name of the show in case people at home are wondering what the heck is this. This is a first. We haven't had a one-man band authentic setup, and this is very similar. I think I saw Dr. Ross perform.
Yes, exactly. Big inspiration.
Yeah. When did he pass?
He passed in the 60s, I think, and his music really influenced my act a lot, obviously.
Yeah, it's incredibly faithful to it, and yet it gives it its own style too. Did his show occur essentially because he needed to busk, and if you were a busker, you had to make a lot of noise, essentially to draw attention. Not only did you have to make music, but you had to be noticed.
Well, I know that I read one interview where he said he just got tired of his band and fired them all and decided he wanted to back himself.
A cost saving.
But it's true that I play in the street in Old Town Alexandria, and for busking, there's nothing better. I think a lot of these guys were not able to carry this much apparatus with them. They'd have to hop a freight train with one guitar. They were lucky they had that. So it's kind of a luxury to be able to play this. But I think for modern ears, coming back through rock and roll, it makes the music more accessible to have a good steady backbeat that you can feel. It tells your hips what to do, and then I can play on top of that. So.
What tune are you going to take us out with?
Okay, the next song is an original song, River of Missing You.
All right, well, I'll do the reverse of the walking blues. I'll shuffle off and take us home.
Thank you.
River, I'm missing you, girl. It flows a long, long way. River, I'm missing you, girl. It flows a long, long way. Since the day you left me, the judgment day. River, I'm missing you, girl. It is deep and wide. River, I'm missing you, girl. It is deep and wide. My heart floods me deep inside. River missing you, girl, it sure can drown a man. River missing you, girl, it sure can drown a man. Want someone on the shore, please lend me your hand. River missing you, girl, it'll break any levee dam. River missing you, girl, it'll break any levee dam. Tore down my life, left me half a man. River missing you, girl, it flows by a willow tree. River missing you, girl, flows by a willow tree. You see those bent down branches, baby? Won't you please think of me?